Welcome to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the First World War. I'm Dan Hill, a military historian and battlefield guide specialising in the history of the war on the Western Front.
And I'm Dr. Spencer Jones, author and senior lecturer in war studies at the University of Wolverhampton.
In this episode, we continue our look into First World War myths. This time, we focus closer to the battlefield to explore some of those long-held beliefs about how the war on the front lines was conducted. Oh, hi Dan, pleased to be joining you as always, and a pleasure to be joining you to discuss a follow-up to last week's episode where we discussed some of the myths of the war, the myth of war enthusiasm, the myth of the short war, and the idea that the war was pointless. Big strategic issues are with social connections. But this week we'll continue our look at myths, but we're going to dive down a little bit into some of the enduring myths of the front line. And I think these in some ways are even more enduring than the myths we looked at last week.
Yeah, a little bit of a bingo card element to this week, I think, for those that, and let's be fair, a lot of this comes from Blackadder. If you're a Brit, a lot of this stuff stems from that famous, very funny, I've got to add, series which I find brilliant, but it's not the best place to get your history from. And I think, in my opinion at least, Spence, certainly since really the 90s into the 2000s, if you were to ask somebody on the street, name something ridiculous about the First World War, or something particularly stupid that was done, a lot of these things are going to stem from the same kind of opinions. Yeah. Generals send men over the top to their deaths, repeatedly doing the same thing, or men walking slowly towards machine guns, all of these kind of elements that we hear about so much. The truth is that when you scrape down beyond the surface and look at these in a lot of detail, a lot of them don't stand up to scrutiny. And maybe we've got a chance to shine a bit of a light on that this week.
I think so. And just about Blackadder, as a number of listeners have informed us, Blackadder was translated and was actually broadcast all over Europe, which I find really interesting. And I know we've had some great listeners comments when they've written in and talked about how the humour translates, and that even in a European context, a Western European context, the humour still makes sense, and that in parts of Western Europe, there's this image that the British Army is like the Blackadder Army. It's foolish, it's stupid, it does the same things over and over again. Of course, the fact that Blackadder is genuinely brilliant comedy, brilliantly scripted, completely on the nose, doesn't help with this. But it ties into ideas that already exist in Europe and then plays on them as well. Because even in Europe, there's ideas in France, in Germany, probably to a lesser extent in Belgium because of how the war's fought, that their generals are foolish and throw lives away. And there is a sort of the image of the callous First World War general is almost a universal across Western Europe, I think. And one of I think perhaps we might want to sort of start with on this is, we discussed this before about generals and about lions led by donkeys, a common idea with the British Army and indeed in British military literature here. Why do you think, Dan, that this idea that the generals are callous, stupid, unthinking, unfeeling, why do you think that's such an enduring one when we compare it to, say, the Second World War, where I don't think that image really holds quite so much weight?
Well, it's a tricky one, actually, and I think to an extent it ties back to what we discussed last week, and that really sort of stems from the 1920s and the years after the First World War, when people are looking back and they're trying to make sense of what's gone on and how so many of their loved ones and family friends and people that they knew from the local sports clubs don't come home at the end of the war. And to try and justify that, there's got to be someone who must have done something wrong somewhere. Well, if that's the case, who is it? Well, you've got to look upwards. You've got to look at the top to these generals. And then when we consider on top of that, the nature of the fighting on the Western Front, the fact that you've got a trench line, no man's land in the middle. And in order to have any success, you've got to go from A to B. And a lot of guys get killed doing so. And for a big chunk, the middle part of the war, it's that same issue. And, you've got to look at it and say, well, why didn't anybody try anything different? Well, the truth is, of course, they did try things differently. And when you really dig down into that story does have much more nuance to it. And I think hopefully we'll address that to a certain extent in this episode. But the idea of generals generally, I just think it boils down to the blame has got to be placed somewhere. And there must be blame. The casualty numbers are that high. There has to be blame attributed. And if you're going to blame somebody, you got to blame the people responsible. And if you're going to do that, it's either the politicians, it's the field marshal, it's the generals, certainly not the men themselves. And I think that's reasonable in that sense. But is it those generals? Are they being absolutely cold and callous? Or is it simply that the world has moved at such a pace and technology has moved on so quickly that they're facing a problem that nobody's managed to deal with before? And having to learn on your feet is tragically very, very bloody.
Well, I think there's a lot to discuss here. And one is, you're absolutely right, that the nature of war has changed abruptly. And we get a lot of questions. We've discussed these, in fact, in the past about what didn't people predict this? Didn't people see these changes? A lot of the armies are expending a lot of intellectual energy trying to predict future trends in warfare. The short answer is it's very, very difficult. It's very difficult to predict the future. No human can do it reliably, and there is an expectation the war will be bloody, but it will be short. And of course, that doesn't happen. In fact, the war becomes extremely prolonged, which adds to its bloodshed, and nobody can do anything because there is deadlock created, as we've discussed in other episodes, by barbed wire, machine guns, artillery, and so forth. So it's very, very difficult to break through this until new methods, and in some cases, entirely new weapons are designed. And yet, although we see generals grappling, trying to work this out and so forth, the problem with working it out is this isn't an abstract. You're doing it with lives. You are fighting battles as you do this. There are casualties. There's no way to sit back and do all this on a planning table. Ultimately, men's lives are being put on the line each time. And I'd add to this, and this is something that certainly, having worked in what we might loosely call academia and looked at studies of the British Army, which have done a lot of great work on how the army functions in the First War, its nuts and bolts, and have tried to revise the idea the British Army was a Blackadder force, lions led by donkeys. I think sometimes we can even go a little bit too far with this. And in trying to defend generals, and I'm applying this to the French, the Germans, and indeed other national armies as well, there are, and this has been true of any war of sufficient size since humanity took up weapons against itself, there are simply some incompetent commanders. There are some terrible mistakes that are made. There are some plans that are produced by the cream of various armies that make you wonder, what were they thinking? It's even now, 100 years removed, I sometimes shake my head at some of the ideas that are produced by certain generals. So there are incompetent generals, and tragically, those incompetent generals lead to a lot of their men being killed and wounded. When you combine that with the incredibly difficult circumstances of the war, there's going to be attrition, it's going to be very hard to break through. I think you've got a lethal cocktail, really, Dan, that incompetent generals are going to lose a lot of men. But even skilled and forward-thinking and innovative generals, it's impossible to fight on the Western Front, this giant fortress area, without losing men. And I think if you look at it, sometimes as a historian, you have to remind yourself when you read about casualties, and this objective was taken for relatively low cost, and it's still thousands of men have been killed and wounded doing it. And so I think there's a balance to strike here about acknowledging the difficulties of being a commander, whilst also acknowledging that these lessons are paid for in blood.
I think there's an extremely important thing that you just said there, actually, and I think it reflects more, certainly to my mind at least, reflects on historians, modern historians particularly, who I think, if I think around my colleagues and your colleagues as well, and we sort of look at the idea of, if you like, trying to rehabilitate the reputation of generals to some extent by saying, well, there are mitigating factors, there are things we need to consider. They didn't have a rule book that they could play from. It was this kind of proverbial poker game where you have to put those chips down that are the lives of men in order to test your hand. Yeah, all of those things are true. Doesn't mean everything is done well. Quite often we like to say, well, think about Haig, he's having to manage this 5.7 million man army out on the Western Front. He's having to do this, that, and the other. Doesn't mean he doesn't make mistakes. And those mistakes are sometimes very highly costing ones. There are many incidences where we can look at and say, actually, it was just a bad decision. And so you mentioning about striking a balance there, I think is absolutely true. So when we talk about the myths of generals being incompetent in the First World War and sending men to their deaths and this kind of thing, generally, I would argue that's not true. Certainly, nobody tries to get their men killed. That's totally untrue. But are mistakes made that result in lots of deaths? Absolutely. And to my mind, too many times. But things do improve as the war goes on. I think this brings in a kind of another important element here. And that's this idea, strange one actually, of just repetition, repeatedly doing the same thing, particularly when it's failed and expecting some kind of different outcome. And we hear this a lot, the idea of, okay, well, General so and so sent these guys over the top on the 1st of July 1916, and they all got killed or mown down. So he tried exactly the same thing the following day. Now, that is one thing that I think, with some justification, we can say actually doesn't happen.
To build upon uh, the idea of Douglas Haig and his problems, and the first of July and the Battle of the Somme. An interesting aspect of the Battle of the Somme is the first day, of course, an appalling experience for the British Army, worst casualties ever suffered by the British Army in its history. The battle has to go on. Haig can't call it off. He's committed to this because of these demands of his allies. What's quite interesting is Haig then says, okay, no success in the north, very little success in the center. There is success in the south next to the French. And he pivots the army's main effort down to the south. And what's quite interesting is he does this against the protests of the French, who say, no, the north is the key to the battlefield. Thiepval is the key here. The Germans are a little bit surprised at the way that the British pivot as well, because they think, well, everything's going to be at Thiepval. And there's reasons for that. Thiepval is the cornerstone of the German line at the Somme. If it falls, the German front line is going to be completely unhinged. But Haig's thrown men against Thiepval, no success, massive casualties. He's not going to do that again. Instead, he's going to try and undermine Thiepval from the south. And I think that's a little bit under-recognized. And if there's one flaw, of course, we've discussed previously with Haig, it's he gets over-optimistic. When some good news comes in, he multiplies it repeatedly in his mind, and he thinks the Germans are often on the brink of collapse, and he pushes too hard with too little. And that is perhaps a case of doing the same thing, never quite learning to moderate his optimism. Perhaps at the very end of the war he does. But in terms of actually trying to find angles, trying to maneuver on the battlefield, trying to do something different, we do see this. We see this with the French as well. We see this with the Germans. We see the commanders of these armies are trying to exploit advantages, trying to do something. And this is an important point. No commander on the Western Front wants to throw his divisions against the enemy, suffer loads of casualties, massive casualties, and achieve nothing. On one hand, the number of generals do feel quite keenly the casualties their troops are taking. And even if you take a more callous-minded general, someone like Ludendorff, who's a pretty cold fish, doesn't really think much about this, he's worried about, well, if I keep having my army smashed up, we're going to lose the war. Or perhaps, if I keep having my army smashed up, I'm going to get sacked, which the generals don't want, of course. So the idea that everything is just done over and over again, I think it's seductive, but it's also completely misleading.
Yeah, it's the generals are, they're the gift that keep on giving in some ways, because there are so many myths kind of wrapped up around this idea of senior officers. There's one which I think we can dispel pretty much without, almost exclusively. There's a little bit of a caveat to this, but I think quite often, certainly in British circles, and perhaps with people who maybe don't have a super in-depth knowledge of the kind of history of the British Army, there's the idea that generals have literally paid their way to the top. The idea that they've bought ranks within the British Army. Now, whilst this is something that did exist prior to the First World War, actually by the time of the First World War, this doesn't exist anymore. Would it be fair to say, though, that everybody's there based on some kind of merit that they've worked their way up, or are there little nuances to this?
I think there's nuances. I think it changes as the war goes on as well. And I think it changes across all the European armies. Eventually, because nations and armies want to win the war, they will start to burn away the incompetent and the inefficient and the politically minded, rather than those men who are going to win battles and win wars. And with the British Army, there is some argument that the British Army likes to look at a fairly narrow base for its more senior commanders. The British Army likes to draw upon regulars, men who are being full-time professional soldiers before the war, whether in the British Army or in the Indian Army as well, which of course has white officers. And that there is a certain reluctance in the British Army to promote men who don't come from that background, be they territorials, be they new army officers or be they men from the Empire, Canada, Australia, etc. And yet, the men who do end up in senior commands within the British Army, yes, there are some who are probably promoted beyond their ability. Schubert Goff of Fifth Army is a good case about this. He's catapulted very high up the ranks, probably higher than he should have gone. But in general, if you look at the army commanders the British Army ends the war with, it's difficult there to find a man who you can say, yep, he's a donkey, he's incompetent, he doesn't know the business of soldiering. You've got men like Herbert Plumer, Julian Byng, Henry Horn, Henry Rawlinson's back. These are experienced men who fought and won battles and have learned from their experiences. And yes, it's taken an extremely long time and a lot of casualties. But if you look at Henry Rawlinson, for example, he's a senior commander in 15. He does a lot of the planning for the Battle of the Somme in 1916. Then he's out of action through 1918, he's back, and he does a lot of the planning for the big British and British Empire counterattack on the 8th of August 1918 at the Battle of Amiens, which is a complete victory for the British forces. And one of the reasons it's such a complete victory is Rawlinson's learned something from his past experiences. So perhaps we struggle to go far enough to say the armies have become meritocracies by 1918. These are huge armies. The idea that every single person, every single commanding figure in the army is completely competent is ultimately unrealistic. But what we can say, I think, is, and this also applies to the German army. The German army has a lot of great commanders. The French army has a lot of great commanders. Generally, by 18, the right people are in the right places in higher command. These are people who know how to fight battles and are ultimately going to win these battles. But even when you win a battle in the First World War, it's always going to cost you a lot of casualties.
It's a very good point that you make there, and this idea of really the cream rising to the top. And just to go back to this idea about the literal purchase and how that could be in previous years kind of skipped over, the fact that the cream rises to the top if you can pay the right amount of money. Well, in the previous century, that would have been true. Actually, the idea of commission purchase or purchasing your way up the ranks leaves the British Army in the 1880s. So actually, there's no British officer serving in the BEF at that time who would have been able to purchase a rank, with a few slight exceptions. If you were to raise an entire regiment, I can think of one or two, you might be offered the colonelcy of it. Though if you prove that you're not up to scratch, you'll be removed of the colonelcy by the end of the war. So there is an element here, and whilst we should acknowledge it, as you did there, Spence, the idea that really your face kind of has to fit at the same time to a certain extent. By 1918, there are some changes in those elements. So officers generally, at the senior level, of course, have and take a fairly significant chunk of the brunt of the blame when it comes to these incredible losses. I think what's maybe a little more disingenuous is the idea of blaming junior officers, or saying that the idea that junior officers would send men over the top to their deaths. This old phrase, go on, boys, off you go. I think that needs to be substituted for a far more powerful phrase, come on, boys, follow me, which when we talk, Spence, about lieutenants and captains and majors to a certain extent, those are the guys, they're not sending lads over the top, they're leading them over.
That's a really good point, and it explains why junior officers suffer such appalling losses throughout the First World War. And if I can just tie that to the point we've just been discussing about generals. Something that's quite interesting in the 1920s and 30s, as disillusionment grows about the First World War and the casualties, is a lot of the most strident voices about the war being a waste, about the needless casualties, about the incompetence, comes from junior officers, because they have to bear the brunt of the general's decisions. And if you are a lieutenant or a captain, or maybe up to the level of being a colonel or a half colonel, your overall vision of the battlefield is very, very limited. You basically see a few hundred yards in front of you, wherever your unit is holding the trench. You'll be assigned pretty discrete objectives. You'll have your objectives on a map. You'll have an idea. You might have trained on a model of the enemy trenches, and then you've got to go. And when it all works, you can be very proud of that. But when it goes wrong and you lead your men out, and as you say, Dan, it's, come on, boys, follow me. You're first out of the trench. The men are behind you. You've got to trust that the army as a system is working. This old idea of combined arms. And if you're bursting across no man's land and your creeping barrage is going too fast and you can't keep up with it, if you're bursting across no man's land and the enemy barbed wire is not cut properly, you encounter unbroken barbed wire. Or if you're running forward and suddenly previously unidentified enemy machine guns start shooting at you, you're going to have problems with all of these situations. And it's your men who are going to suffer. Your men are getting killed and wounded. Men you might have known for years. Your veterans, your NCOs, you might have known these men for years. Almost like brothers. A band of brothers concept does exist in armies of all the First World War. And to see your men killed in this way and wounded in this way, and there's nothing you as a junior officer can really do. You run into a massive unbroken barbed wire, there's nothing the infantry can do. They have no means to breach this barbed wire on a large scale. It's inevitable you can become frustrated and angry and bitter about the men who didn't understand the situation and have sent you into this unwinnable battle. And so much of the disillusionment literature, as we call it in the 20s and especially into the 30s, comes not from the common soldier, but from younger officers. Men like Siegfried Sassoon, Robert Graves in Britain, very prominent, for example, who are reflecting bitterly on what they've been asked to do in the war. And that, I think, adds a wrinkle of complexity to the generals debate, because as a junior officer, you bear the brunt of this and you reflect on it and you suffer the emotional shock of seeing your comrades killed. And to tie this back to Blackadder, I think that's one of the reasons why in the characters of Blackadder, the only character in his right mind is actually Edmund Blackadder, who is a mid-ranking officer, and he can see the utter blithering stupidity of the superior command. And he's there. He's the only man in his right mind, and in a way, that's plugging into this idea of junior officers as the truth seers on the front line in many respects.
This whole idea of, I think, the callous machine generally is one that we can see throughout the First World War. And to say that certain rank, I think there's some truth in the whole the captain rank actually having a decent vision of the front line, because they kind of straddle that position between the other ranks, the lads literally on the coalface, and the senior officers somewhere up the tree. They do have that little bit broader perspective. That being said, it's also those guys that are paying the heaviest price. Captain is proportionally the deadliest rank to hold in the First World War. So, this extra vision, if you like, does come with a price tag. But, just expanding this idea, I think you can expand it not only in the army, but throughout all ranks of the BEF, of the American forces, of French and Germans as well. This idea of callousness generally. Now, I don't think it's a personal callousness. I don't think you'll find a general who just does not care if any of his guys are killed. You find a system that is kind of ingrained with that concept, just simply because of the size of it. You see all kinds of decisions that are made, and you think on face value, oh, these are just crazy thoughts. But actually, when you drill down into them, actually, quite often there has been some consideration made behind them. And you can do it with the Navy, you can do it with the Air Force, for example. I mean, take the concept of not issuing parachutes to pilots, because apparently it might stop men from abandoning an aircraft where it could be saved. On face value, that sounds like an extremely callous administrative decision made by somebody who's got nothing to do with aircraft, has no idea what they're talking about, and has made a decision that is going to cost lots and lots of lives. But when you dig down into that particular idea, Spence, it's way more interesting. If you speak to individual pilots on the front lines, quite a lot of them say, I don't want a parachute.
We did discuss this in our air power episode, but it's really worth revisiting that carrying parachutes in the First World War is not as simple as it sounds. There are parachutes that you ultimately strap to your back are available, but they're too big to carry into single-seat or indeed two-seat aircraft. Instead, you're going to have your parachute usually strapped to the side of your plane. The idea about how you bail out from it is you basically attach yourself to the parachute and jump off the side, and then that will rip the cords and your parachute will open. But parachutes are bulky and they're heavy. And in the aerial combat of the First World War, one of the big problems is two things kill in aerial combat: speed and altitude. And pilots remove parts from their planes, especially fighter pilots, remove parts from their planes so they can achieve more of either. If you're faster and you're higher than your opponent, you've got a very good chance of surviving any engagement. If you're slower than your opponent, you're in trouble. If you don't have altitude on your opponent, you're also in trouble. And parachutes diminish both of these things. And so there is some rejection from pilots about this. There is also, I think, that's practical. You may have a parachute, makes you safer. Getting into the parachute is really, really difficult. You're in a burning plane or a plane that's in a terminal dive. It's not an easy thing to clamber out of your cockpit, attach yourself, and jump off the side. So there's that. And there's also, I think, and you see this more in British discussion of being a fighter, there's a sort of young man's cockiness saying, well, we don't need parachutes because we're not going to get shot down. And that's an attitude I think you find amongst youngsters. You're full of energy and testosterone. And yes, the British Air Force, the Royal Flying Corps, is really against the idea of parachutes. It thinks that men might jump out of their planes prematurely and so on. And indeed, that may well have happened. But it's a much more complicated issue than just the high command going, no, you can't have parachutes because you'll abandon your plane immediately. In fact, there's a lot of factors feeding into this. And I think that's true of so many of the myths of the First World War. The headline's appealing because it plugs into an idea we already have. Unthinking, callous commanders, sacrifice, and so forth. The reality isn't quite such an appealing story. And I think something that's quite common to a lot of these myths is they tell a very simple, appealing narrative that makes sense. And when you burrow into them and actually start looking at them, well, it's a lot more complicated. Not quite so appealing to share this. It doesn't make for a good soundbite if you're a talking head on a documentary.
Very true. And I think there's some truth in that if we go back to the trenches as well. We constantly, if you were to watch any movie about the First World War, watch any documentary, even have a conversation like we are, listen to a podcast, quite often that conversation is about action. It's about those moments where men go over the top. It's about those fights that go on. The truth is, if you were to look at all of the literature that's out there, there's a pretty strongly held belief, and I think this is something of a myth, that people are going over the top once a week. Every week you're attacking over the top. Truth is, that simply isn't the case, and for good reason. Talk about short wars, Spence. It would be a very short war if you were going over the top every day, because there'd be nobody left in a very short period of time, because they're extremely bloody events that typically cause enormously high casualties. The reality is, going over the top is actually a really rare experience.
You might go through, it's unlikely. And certainly from the German and the French perspective, it's almost vanishingly unlikely. But it is possible that you could spend the entire First World War and as an infantryman, as a combat soldier, and never actually go over the top. You need to be pretty lucky to be in that position, and certain circumstances will need to play into place. But there are some units that just don't see that much action. And this is true of all the armies, less the French and the Germans, who by necessity have to commit lots and lots of forces. But there's some British formations that see very little action in the entire war. They're using trench holding duties and so forth. And that, I think, that what I've just mentioned, trench holding, is the forgotten part of the First World War. We think it is all, great roars as the men burst out of their trenches, rush across no man's land into action. In fact, as we discussed in our 24 Hours in a Trench episode, the vast majority of your time as an infantryman on the Western Front is spent carrying out what are basically pretty monotonous duties in a trench, waiting for something to happen. There's a very distinct fighting season on the Western Front because the weather conditions dictate the pace of war. Although there are battles fought in December and January, generally you don't get big battles in the winter because the conditions are poor, the ground is very hard, lots of things to mitigate against it. Generally, your fighting season is going to be from the spring, March, April, up until the autumn, October, November. Then you'll have a winter period where you won't have major battles. And even in that fighting period, there's not a battle on every part of the front every day of the week. The build-up to big over-the-top attacks take weeks. They build up. They're going to come. It's obviously an enormous experience, a colossal experience if you're in this. But for the vast majority of soldiers, you're not going to do this very often. Maybe once or twice. Maybe not even that, as you said. You may be in a battle, but never actually have an over-the-top attack. You might be a relief or a reinforcement. And I think because the image of the over-the-top attack is so powerful, and of course, if you were in it, it was a shocking experience. Noise, violence, confusion. It's so appealing. It captures something about the First World War. Whereas standing around in a trench for 24 hours, cleaning your kit, whittling some wood, writing some letters, reading some letters, drinking your tot of rum, although that's the average day-to-day experience for, certainly in the British Army, the vast majority of British soldiers, it doesn't make for very appealing movies, novels. Although, point on that, a lot of novels in the 20s and 30s emphasize the almost domesticity of being in the trenches. Not a lot happens. Instead, you have to make relationships, you have to make things work. But certainly now, 100 years on, we don't really want to sort of talk about that. And I go back to a point that you made, Dan, in a previous episode, to emphasize that this doesn't diminish the courage of serving in the First World War. Going over the top once would be enough for most of us, and I'm sure you'd agree with that, listeners. And it takes a very distinct type of courage to simply be in the trenches at all. And I forget the exact words you used, Dan, but the courage in the First World War wasn't charging into battle. It was simply enduring the conditions of the First World War.
I can agree more. Well, in fact, it was my statement, so I definitely agree with it. But yeah, no, absolutely. I think that actually comes from the late great Richard Holmes, who said exactly that. He said that going over the top is one thing, but simply enduring is really the true courage that he mentions there. And I think it sums it up quite well. It also, this idea of seeing these kind of over the top actions, the ones that we famously focus on, the ones that you see in the media and all of this kind of thing, I think also open the door to other myths, or I say myths, I think more misconceptions about the Great War. One of them being that everybody's killed by a machine gun. These machine guns are rattling away and they're killing these men walking towards them across no man's land. And, if you've got a relative that's killed in the Great War, that's how it's going to end for them. I think what's often overlooked is the reality of that situation. At least 6 out of 10, possibly 7 out of 10 men of any nation that are killed in the Great War, any time in the Great War, are going to be killed by artillery fire. It's not machine guns that are doing the killing, it's artillery. And it's much less glamorous, I think, in a sense. Not to say that going over the top is glamorous, but it's certainly the thing that's pointed at to more. The idea of being killed whilst you're sitting in a latrine 4 miles behind the line, or you're carrying a pile of wood from one doorway across a street and a shell comes in and hits you with some high explosive fragment of metal flying at a few hundred miles an hour and ends your life in some ignominious position like that. Nobody really wants to think of that as being the end of their loved one. But the truth is, in the majority of cases, that is exactly what it is. And that simple truth that most men are killed in a situation that isn't a formal over-the-top attack, but just going about their daily duties. One, I think, underpins that idea that it's the endurance of the soldier on the front lines or even behind the lines that's really powerful. But also, I think it's a duty of ours to some extent to acknowledge that that's the truth and not to overlook it and just say, oh, yeah, it's all machine guns. Well, we're historians of the subject. We should be telling the story as it is true, as it's represented.
I agree. And again, I think this goes back to the complexity and just the point you've made about people carrying some lumber, some firewood, suddenly get misfortune to be caught by an artillery shell, maybe even a stray artillery shell. A gun is what they call it. The gun is sneezing or the gun is clearing its throat. Sometimes gunners will fire around just to test the barrel and things. They're not even really aiming at something, but this is still lethal ammunition, and it can and indeed does kill. And this goes back, I think, to the frustrations in some ways of the junior officer and so forth, and the disillusionment, the callousness, because the nature of death on the Western Front is often so random. A mortar round or a burst of shells flies in, hits a trench, everyone ducks, you lift your head up, oh, we're all okay. There's one unfortunate man who's got a shell splinter gone through his head and has been killed. What are the chances? There's incidents where people are just doing, as you say, Dan, the most mundane tasks and are killed by shells or snipers or sudden bursts of gunfire. And the nature of these losses, I think, the callousness, the fact you can't really do anything about them. You're not even in an over-the-top attack. You're not even fighting for an objective. You are going about your business in the trenches, and incoming fire kills somebody, can lead to a lot of the frustration and the disillusionment, because it's one thing to die, facing the enemy, rifle in hand, the last stand or the heroic charge. That's a very common image in European military imagery, European military writing prior to the First World War. But as you say, being hit when you're going to the latrine trench or chopping some grass or something like that, this isn't part of this. And the random nature of it makes or can contribute to an idea that the war is futile and difficult and so forth. And of course, one thing that we see, certainly in Britain, is officers write back to loved ones when family members have been killed. And a lot of these letters now digitized or being made available in various works. One thing that's really tragic is the number of men who are killed in just this way. And although the battles are where the majority of casualties are going to be sustained, even in the quiet sectors, even in the boring trenches that we've laid out, you're still going to have killed and wounded almost every single day, just due to the random nature of violence. And I think this contributes to this disillusionment, because why are the generals keeping us here to just be shot at and blown up? Why aren't we doing something about it? This was just, almost a sense of madness. Why are we holding this line of being shot at? Nothing's happening. What's the point of it? It adds a complexity to the war that, again, I don't think can be expressed easily in shorthand, which is one of the reasons we're having an entire podcast episode on it. But I think for our listeners who I know very, very keen on the First War, obviously, many of you extraordinarily well read on it, I think you understand that these wrinkles in some ways is what makes the mosaic of the First World War rewarding to study, but also necessary to study.
It really is a subject that, we could never really get to the end of it, because it just evolves the whole time. But, talking of getting towards the end of the war on Western Front, as we get towards the end of this episode, actually, I think one of the things that's quite often overlooked in this scenario is the final advances of the Allies in the 100 days. We talk a lot about the futility, about the lost battles and the catastrophes and the disasters that go on. And you can understand why that's popular. Same thing happens in the Second World War. It's why Omaha Beach is talked about and not the other beaches, because it's the one that goes wrong. But we need to, I think, to some extent, and maybe in fairness, to do right by the guys that actually took part in this, to discuss or at least acknowledge the fact that sometimes things go well and sometimes things end positively. And the Great War ends on the 11th of November 1918, not because it's lost, but because it's won, at least from the British or the Allied perspective, I should say. And it's won because people managed to do things right, do things well, and they managed to eventually break through the Western Front. Although that being said, Spence, I'm going to throw another wrinkle in here. If we're Brits, and I think we need to eat a little bit of humble pie on this one, quite often we'll talk about the idea of the Great War coming to an end with what's known as the 100 Days Offensive, fantastic battle that's launched on the 8th of August 1918 outside a little place called Amiens, and results in the British, the Canadians, and the Australians breaking over the Western Front and advancing to victory alongside their American allies. Is that really the day that the war starts to be won once and for all? Probably not.
No, indeed. Discuss, as they say. And certainly from a British and by extension a British Empire perspective, this is the day the war turns. But in actual fact, I think this writes out, and it's not necessarily a conscious decision to do this. It's simply, where's the British Army at the time? That's where the press focus will land. And that's going to be opening the offensive on the 8th of August 1918. But it writes out the French and the Americans who are fighting down at the Second Battle of the Marne, which is a decisive victory, if ever there was one. A German offensive soaked, the pressure soaked, and then a massive Franco-American counterattack with a little bit of British and indeed British Air Force contribution. But it deals a massive blow to the German army. And really, that is the moment that I think Germany, you can argue, when does Germany lose the war? But on the battlefield, Second Marne is such a decisive turning point. It's the biggest defeat that's been inflicted on the German army up to that point, probably since First Marne in 1914. And perhaps a certain irony that it's fought across similar battlefields. Huge blow. From memory, I think something like 20 German divisions are removed from action as a result of this, casualties. And it's nearly an even bigger victory because the French want to really encircle this pocket of Germans. Can't quite do it. They don't quite have the speed and the mobility to do it. But they inflict a huge blow. And really, that's the start of the Allied counteroffensive. And a point I was also that it's worth making is, of course, the man who's overseeing all these offensives, although these are being fought by national armies, is a Frenchman, Ferdinand Foch. who has become the Generalissimo, who is handling all the Allied armies. He's the supreme commander of the Allied forces. And although certainly in Britain, there's the Battle of Amiens is seen as a great victory, which it is. It's memorably, Ludendorff describes it as the Black Day of the German army, and it deals a serious blow to the Germans. The Second Battle of the Marne has started this process. If there hadn't been for the massive damage the French and the Americans had inflicted on the Germans, the scale of the British and British Empire victory in August might not have been quite the same. The fighting might have been a little bit different. And so there is that factor there. And that's perhaps another myth we could tackle in a future discussion down who actually is the dominant player in the First World War, the British, the French, or indeed somebody else. But that's perhaps a discussion for another episode.
Yeah, I think so. There's so many elements that we can touch on with this fascinating subject. I will point out though, as we get to the end of this, and just finishing on the point that you made there, one thing that shouldn't be forgotten is that the victory that is achieved on the Western Front that ultimately ends with the armistice on the 11th of November 1918 is absolutely an Allied one. And I think to give any nation majority credit in that sense would be unfair to all of those participants that took part. And so, as we continue, I suppose, our journey of discovery, Spence, with the story of the war on the Western Front, really glad that you guys come along and join us. Hopefully you'll come and join us next time as we continue looking at the First World War from a whole new perspective.
You've been listening to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, a Battle Guide production. If you've enjoyed this podcast, why not check out the Battle Guide YouTube channel, where we regularly release documentaries exploring some of the most famous and extraordinary episodes from throughout military history. If you'd like to support the Battle Guide team to create more content just like this, why not head over to our Patreon, where for the cost of just a cup of coffee, you can get access to full-length virtual battlefield tours, exclusive behind-the-scenes content, decide which subjects we cover in future podcasts and videos, and join a fantastic community of like-minded people. That's all this time. See you again soon.
Captain is proportionally the deadliest single rank to hold in the First World War. Captain is the deadliest single rank by if you take them. I messed that up.